In the last video, we spoke about 5 momentous events in the history of the late Western Roman Empire. From the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD to the invasion of Africa by the Vandals from 429 to 439 AD. Now we will continue with the later Roman Empire. The very last tries to save it, and we shall even continue with the remaining Eastern Roman Empire, its ambitions to restore the lost provinces in the west and to restore the Imperium Romanum to its former glory. 1. The murder of Flavius Aetius in 454. The last time we talked about Flavius Aetius' efforts to restore Roman rule in Gallia and Raetia, but also his failing in preventing the invasion of Africa by the Vandals, a black stain on his career. By 429, he had risen to the rank of Magister Militum, the supreme general of the Western Empire. He managed to stabilize the situation in Gallia and Raetia, but had failed to recover large parts of Hispania for the empire, and had failed to prevent the Vandal capture of Africa. His greatest achievement is defeating Attila the Hun at the legendary Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 AD. This was a decisive moment in the late Western Roman Empire, and had it not been for this victory, the empire most likely would have fallen even earlier. It is interesting to observe the astounding victories that the late Western Roman Empire was able to achieve despite its utterly crippled state. Aetius had now grown to such prominence that the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III had become jealous of Aetius. 2 prominent figures that were opposed to Aetius, Petronius Maximus and Heraclius, had so managed to enlist Valentinian in a plot to assassinate Aetius. According to the ancient historian Priscus of Panium, on September 21st, 454 AD, while Aetius was at the imperial court in Ravenna, Valentinian struck the unsuspecting Aetius with his own sword without warning, helped by Heraclius. According to Sidonius Apollinaris, after the deed, Valentinian had boasted about disposing of Aetius, but someone at the imperial court replied to this, "Whether well or not, I do not know, but know that you have cut off your right hand with your left." And indeed, it was so. Only 1 year later, Valentinian himself was killed by loyal followers of Aetius at the Campus Martius in Rome. The same year, Rome was sacked by the Vandals, this time even more thoroughly than in 410 during the Visigothic sack. Now the empire would unravel even faster, leading to the dissolution of the West only 21 years later. Had Valentinian been an able emperor, he would have known about the disastrous effects that the assassination of Aetius would have on the empire. Had Aetius not been killed, a restoration of rule in Gallia and Hispania would have been more likely, and the reconquest of Africa a few years later might thus have had better chances of succeeding. In that case, the Western Empire might have survived for longer than it did in our timeline. 2. Majorian's Reconquests 457 to 461. Majorian is generally considered the last great emperor of the Western Roman Empire. According to Edward Gibbon, Majorian represents the welcome discovery of a great and heroic character, such as sometimes arise in a degenerate age to vindicate the honor of the human species. Procopius of Caesarea, an Eastern Roman historian of the 6th century, about whom we shall talk in much more detail in future videos, wrote this about Majorian. Majorian surpassed in virtue all of the previous emperors. While this certainly is an exaggerated statement, it shows the reverence which the population held towards that noble emperor. Julius Valerius Maiorianus was proclaimed emperor in 457, and instead of being a weak emperor, which was common during these waning days of the Western Imperium, he instead enacted many reforms, from tax reforms to economic reforms, but also societal reforms, and he even enacted reforms for the protection and restoration of the grandiose monuments in the city of Rome. He then embarked on a very successful campaign against the Germanic tribes that had settled within the borders of the empire and reconquered vast territories for the Imperium, something that would have seemed impossible during these last decades of Western Rome. By 460, many Germanic kingdoms had been defeated by him and reduced to foederati status, and Majorian was now ready for his magnum opus, the invasion of Africa and the destruction of Geiseric's Vandal kingdom. Unfortunately, however, the Western Roman fleet of around 300 ships that Majorian had built was burned by traitors before it could be set into motion. These traitors were paid by the Vandals, who had accumulated lots of riches from their plundering of Rome in 455. After that defeat, Majorian made back for Italy in order to further enact much needed reforms, strengthen the tax revenue of the bankrupt Western Empire, and even had plans to start rebuilding the Roman legions with native Roman recruits from Italy. We shall talk in a lot more detail about Majorian's many laws, reforms and plans in future videos. However, while Majorian was campaigning, the Magister Militum Ricimer, left behind in Italy, had grown jealous of Majorian's success and had, together with the Roman aristocrats, started plotting against the emperor. Majorian was disliked by many corrupt senators and aristocrats since he forced them to pay their fair share of taxes. Also, the prospect of Italians having to be forced to fight again was unthinkable for many degenerate Western Roman politicians of that time. So it was then that on his way back to Italy, Majorian had disbanded his foederati troops, but was intercepted by Ricimer at Tortona in 461. Without his army, he was defenseless against Ricimer and was executed by the barbarian general. I talked extensively about Ricimer's evil deeds in the first video on this channel. Thus, Rome had been robbed of its last great protector, and only 15 years later it was all over, in very large part due to Ricimer's treachery. Had Majorian been more careful with his naval fleet and suspected traitors and averted the burning of his fleet, history might have gone down a very different path. Judging by his previous successes, Majorian was a brilliant tactician and might have managed to reconquer Africa. With Africa under control of the Western Empire, the tax revenue would have been massively increased, allowing Majorian to increase the size of his foederati army considerably. On his way back to Italy, he would not have disbanded his mercenary army, since some think that he only disbanded it because of a lack of funds. Ricimer would thus not have had any chance of killing Majorian, but hostilities would have still grown between the two, and so a battle would have been inevitable. Majorian would have most likely won, since he was the better commander and would in this timeline have had the more war-experienced and more loyal troops. Maiorianus then might have survived into his 60s or 70s and might have been the first emperor in a long time to reign for 20 or more years. The fall of the Western Roman Empire would have been averted and the Imperium could have stabilized, thus surviving for many more years than in our timeline. 3. The Battle of Cape Bon in 468 AD. The great naval operation of 468 was the last concerted effort between the Eastern and the Western Roman Empire, and also represents the very last effort to save the dying Western Imperium. The Eastern Roman Emperor Leo assembled a gigantic fleet of over 1,100 ships in order to reconquer North Africa from the Vandals. This is considered to be one of the largest amphibian operations of antiquity. We shall talk about this operation in more detail in a separate video. But in short, the main force was to advance on Carthage and deal a decisive blow to Gaiseric. The naval commander Basiliscus was able to inflict a series of defeats on the Vandals before landing at Cape Bon in North Africa. Gaiseric proposed a truce so that he would be able to put into effect the demands of Emperor Leo, which Basiliscus accepted. He was certain that the Vandals had been defeated and that Gaiseric would accept the terms brought forth by Leo. However, this was just a ruse by Gaiseric, when in reality he had just played for time and had secretly prepared a fleet of fireships. When the wind turned in their favor, the Vandals launched the fireships against the unsuspecting Roman fleet that anchored at Cape Bon. A large part of the Roman fleet was thus destroyed by fire, and the rest had to retreat and abandon the invasion. The able Western Roman commander Marcellinus, meanwhile, was stationed in Sicily and would launch an attack on the Vandals from there, but was killed by one of his officers. It is thought that Ricimer, the evil Magister Militum of the West, was behind this deed. With Marcellinus dead, the war effort now completely collapsed, and the Romans had failed to destroy the Vandal kingdom and to reconquer Africa. The fate of the Western Empire was now sealed. But had Basiliscus seen through Gaiseric's ruse, the operation could have been a success. It certainly did not fail because of a lack of Roman resources or ships or troops. Had Basiliscus been more careful and had he not trusted Gaiseric, the Romans could have landed and invaded the Vandals much in the same way how Belisarius did some 65 years later. In that alternate timeline, with Northern Africa again under Roman control, the empire might have had better chances of surviving. Of course, the situation in Gallia and Hispania was still very dire, but with revenue from Africa and the Eastern Roman fleet completely intact, Rome would have been in a far better position. In this timeline, it is quite likely that the Western Roman Emperor during that time, Anthemius, would have won the civil war against Ricimer. Anthemius might have managed to consolidate Western Roman power, although it would have been much harder than only 8 years earlier under Maiorianus. But still, had Basiliscus decided not to trust Gaiseric too easily on this fateful day at Cape Bon, history might look very different now. 4. Justinian's reconquest of 533 to 554 AD. We are often being taught that after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Imperium Romanum was basically over. However, it turns out that this is an oversimplification. As we shall see in future videos, the city of Rome itself continued to prosper under the rule of the Ostrogothic king Theodoric. But in the east, Constantinople was the capital and it was flourishing. A new ambitious emperor had taken the throne in 527, and his ambition was nothing less than to restore Roman rule in the west. The Mediterranean should once again be called Mare Nostrum. To this end, he sent one of the most brilliant military commanders of all time to accomplish this task, Flavius Belisarius. Belisarius landed in 533 in northern Africa, and what Majorian, Anthemius, Basiliscus and Leo had failed to achieve only 65 to 72 years earlier, Belisarius would achieve now. In a series of astounding victories, Belisarius ended the Vandal kingdom, restoring Africa once again as a Roman province in 534 after 100 years, incorporating it again as part of the Imperium Romanum. He then recaptured Sicily in 535 and started the invasion of Italy in 536. He captured Naples in a genius move by entering the city over the aqueducts and then marched upon Rome itself. He entered Rome, the Eternal City, on December 9, 536 through the Porta Asinaria, the Asinarian Gate, and Rome, the jewel of the empire, after 60 years was now again part of the Imperium Romanum. The war raged on for 2 more decades, with Belisarius being recalled to Constantinople, then having to fight on the Eastern Front against the Persians, then having to reconquer Italy again after it had been reconquered again by the Goths. The Ostrogoths would prove formidable enemies, and Belisarius most often lacked the resources to achieve a decisive victory, quite possibly because Justinian didn't want to see Belisarius become too powerful. Even more so because there were rumors floating around that Belisarius would want to make himself emperor of a new Western Roman Empire. But we shall talk in great detail about these war efforts, the so-called Gothic Wars, in future videos, as very much had happened in these wars. But basically only as late as 553 did the Eastern Romans manage to defeat the Goths under the also very able military commander Narses, and to repel an invasion by Franks and Alemanni into Italy in 554. Unfortunately though, the Eastern Romans had bad luck. In 536, an extreme weather event took place, possibly caused by volcanic eruptions that saw the sky darkened for many months. The Eastern Roman historian Procopius wrote, "During this year, a most dread portent took place, for the sun gave forth its light without brightness, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear." This event led to a severe drop in temperatures, causing crop failures and thus famine throughout the empire. To make matters worse, only a few years later, in 541, the plague broke out in Roman Egypt and consecutively spread to the whole Mediterranean until 544 and persisted until 549. The much more populous and denser cities of the highly urbanized Roman Empire were much more strongly affected by this plague than the sparsely populated areas of Northern and Western Europe and their Germanic kingdoms. It is thought that a quarter of the Roman population died in this disastrous plague. These catastrophic events, the darkening of the sky and crop failures in combination with the plague, severely crippled the Eastern Roman Empire's population, so that afterwards it did not have enough manpower to consolidate the newly conquered territories. This map of the Roman Empire in the 550s thus unfortunately remained only a snapshot, and not long afterwards the new territories began collapsing under new attacks by foreign invaders. Also, the war had inflicted a lot of harm. Actually, it had devastated Italy. It ushered in the decline of the city of Rome and started the Dark Ages in Italy, as we shall discuss in future videos. Had history gone differently, had the event of 536 not have taken place, and had the plague in 541 not have broken out, or had the war effort gone better, as Belisarius would have received more support and troops by Justinian, it is very possible that the Roman Empire might have been restored to some extent. In this alternate timeline, the Roman Empire might have regained a lot of the lost territories of the former Western Roman Empire and might have survived far longer. This strengthened empire would have been quite possibly able to resist the Muslim invasions of the 7th century and would have been able to maintain control of Africa, Egypt, Syria, Palestine and Anatolia. Thus, the Roman Empire would have lasted for many more centuries, drastically increasing the likelihood that it would have survived even later than 1453 AD. In fact, it is not even unrealistic to think that this enlarged, powerful Byzantine Empire would have been able to survive until modern times, but of course in a strongly changed form. 5. The very last try. Constantine II's Reconquest. After the Eastern Roman Empire had been crippled by crop failures, famine and plague, it rapidly lost many of the provinces recaptured by Belisarius and Narses for the Eastern Roman Empire. Of course, the constant battles between the Romans and the Sassanid Empire also drained the empire of vital troops that would have been needed in these coming decades. The Lombards had thus fallen into Italy, and the Slavs had captured large parts of the Balkans. To make matters worse, a new enemy came from a location that took both the Romans and the Persians by surprise, namely from the Arabian Peninsula. A series of battles led to the defeat of the Sassanid Empire, and by 654 AD it had ceased to exist and had become part of the new Islamic Caliphate. This new caliphate continued expanding westward, and by 641 Alexandria had been captured. By 646 even the whole of Egypt had become part of the Islamic Empire. The province had fallen so quickly no less because the imperial rule of Constantinople was absolutely not popular because of the very harsh taxation imposed onto the population. The population was therefore not too keen on defending against the Arabs. Syria and Palestine had also fallen. This led to the collapse of the Eastern Roman trade network and the drying up of the grain supply to Constantinople, ushering in the decline of the city from these times onwards. It was during these dark times that Constantine II became new Roman emperor in 641 AD. A first try to defeat the Muslims in a naval battle at Phoenice ended in a disaster for the Eastern Romans, with almost their entire fleet being destroyed. An attempt to siege Constantinople was repelled though, and the Arabic fleet had to withdraw. A civil war broke out in the Caliphate, giving Constans time to prepare his military campaign. He defeated the Slavs in 658, restoring Roman rule in the Balkans to some extent. In Italy, he had less success in defeating the Lombards, so that Italy would remain fractured. He visited Rome in 663 AD for 12 days, the first emperor to set foot into Rome for almost 200 years. But instead of restoring the city to its former splendor, he stripped the public buildings, monuments and temples of all valuables that were left after the many sacks that the city had to endure in the 5th and 6th centuries. He sent his loot off to the treasury in Constantinople and would continue this practice in Calabria and Sardinia, enraging his Italian subjects. He then moved to Sicily, and there were even rumors floating around that he intended to move the Eastern Roman capital to Syracuse in Sicily, where he would set in motion his grand plan, the reconquest of Egypt. Syracuse would act as the base of this operation. Unfortunately though, as he did in Rome, Calabria and Sardinia, he taxed his subjects in such a rigorous way that he had become very hated by the population. Having, with his merciless taxation and stripping of ancient Roman buildings, managed to build up the imperial treasury for his reconquest efforts, he at the same time had managed to alienate his subjects to such an extent that it would be his undoing. In 668, he was killed in a bathhouse in Syracuse by one of his enraged subjects. With him, the last efforts to repel the Islamic invasions had died, and not long afterwards, Carthage would also fall to the Caliphate. Had Constans had the foresight to be a more generous ruler, not to ruthlessly tax his subjects to the brink, he might have lived. We don't know if he would have succeeded in reconquering Egypt, Syria or Palestine, but there is a chance that he could have been victorious, even though realistically this chance was not very high. From then onwards, the Eastern Roman Empire would be on the retreat, except for a remarkable brief period around the year 1000 under Basil II. Of course, restoring the Western Roman Empire was by the reign of Constans an impossibility, but the Eastern Roman Empire would have had far better chances of surviving even after 1453 had Constans managed to reconquer the lost provinces. In that timeline, the Middle East would now look very different from what we are used to in our world. So we can see that the end of the Roman Empire was never a certainty, and it is quite astonishing to see that the Roman Empire could have been restored even as late as the 6th century with Justinian's reconquests, and might even have partially been restored to some extent as late as the mid-7th century. The world in these timelines would look very different from ours, and I will certainly do some dedicated videos on alternate history where we can explore the fascinating possibilities of what could have been if the Imperium would not have fallen. But until then, friends, thanks for watching and bene vale amici.